You see these stories in movies about wicked stepmothers and hidden fortunes, and you think, that could never happen in real life. Well, I am living proof that it does. My name is Elian Valerius. I'm 26 years old, a junior architect barely making rent, and the stepson of a woman who had ice water running through her veins. For 15 years, Dora was the shadow over my life. She married my father when I was 11, and from the moment she walked into our home, the warmth sucked right out of the room. We called her the Ice Queen behind her back, though I think she knew and actually liked the nickname. She was beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, always perfectly dressed and completely untouchable. She didn't marry my dad for love. She married him for the empire he built, and when he passed away 3 years ago, she took over everything. She treated me like an unwanted piece of furniture, something to be dusted around and ignored. I moved out the second I turned 18 and rarely looked back. I thought I knew exactly who Dora was, a greedy, cold-hearted socialite who loved money more than people. I had accepted that I would never see a dime of my father's legacy and that Dora would live forever, clutching her pearls and her checkbook. But life has a funny way of flipping the script when you least expect it. The drama didn't start with a bang. It started with silence, followed by a sudden, chaotic unraveling of everything I thought was true. It was a Tuesday evening, raining hard against the windows of my small apartment, when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my gut told me to answer it. The voice on the other end was deep, serious, and official. It was a sheriff from a county 3 states away. He asked me to verify my identity, and then he delivered the news that would change my entire existence. He told me that Dora was dead. My reaction wasn't what you might expect. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, gripping the phone, feeling a strange numbness spread through my chest. The sheriff explained that Dora had been hiking on a remote trail known as Devil's Drop. It was a treacherous path, one that experienced hikers avoided during the rainy season. According to the report, she had slipped near the edge. I couldn't process it. Dora wasn't the hiking type. She was the type of woman who wouldn't walk on grass in high heels for fear of sinking. Why was she on a muddy, dangerous trail in the middle of nowhere? The sheriff said they found her backpack and her phone near the cliff edge, along with skid marks in the mud indicating a fall. I thanked him robotically and hung up. I sat in the dark for hours, trying to feel sad, but all I felt was a confusing mix of shock and a quiet, guilty relief. The Ice Queen was gone. 2 days later, I arrived at the police station near the trail to collect her personal effects. The atmosphere was grim. The lead detective sat me down and explained why there was no body to bury. The cliff Dora had fallen from dropped over 300 feet directly into a raging river. Because of the recent storms, the water levels were historically high, and the current was violent. He told me that divers couldn't go in. It was a suicide mission. "We've done aerial sweeps," the detective said, sliding a map across the desk with red circles drawn on it. "But frankly, Mr. Valerius, nature has taken over. In these conditions, bodies are often swept miles downstream or trapped in underwater caves. We have declared it an accidental death based on the physical evidence at the scene." He handed me a plastic bag containing her smashed phone and a muddy scarf. It felt too fast. The file was being closed before I had even fully grasped what happened. I looked at the muddy scarf in the bag. It was cashmere, of course. I asked if there were any witnesses, any cameras, anything at all. He shook his head. "It's the wilderness, son. There are no eyes out there." I signed the paperwork, officially accepting that my stepmother had vanished into the river. I walked out of the station feeling less like a grieving son and more like a man who had just watched a magic trick he couldn't explain. The memorial service was held a week later, and it was exactly the kind of event Dora would have wanted, and the kind I hated. It was held at a high-end event space in the city, filled with massive white floral arrangements that cost more than my car. The room was packed with people, but I doubted a single one of them actually missed her. These were her friends, a collection of socialites, business rivals, and distant relatives who smelled money in the water. I stood by the entrance, shaking hands and nodding as people offered hollow condolences. "She was a force of nature," one man said, checking his watch. "Such a tragedy," a woman in a fur coat whispered, her eyes scanning the room to see who else was there. I felt like an imposter at my own family event. They looked at me with pity, but I could see the calculation in their eyes. They were wondering who would get the house, the stocks, the jewelry. These vultures were already circling. I overheard two of Dora's business partners arguing near the buffet about a merger that would likely fall through now that she was gone. It made me sick. I realized then that Dora had built a life entirely around transaction and status. There was no love in this room, only leverage. I left early, unable to stomach another fake smile or another conversation about how tragic it all was. I just wanted to go to her house, lock the door, and breathe. After the memorial, I drove to the estate. It was a sprawling mansion on the hill, the place I had grown up in but never felt at home. Now it was completely silent. The staff had been given the week off, so I was alone in the cavernous halls. The silence was heavy, pressing against my ears. I walked through the living room, where the furniture was covered in white sheets, looking like ghosts in the moonlight. I found myself drawn to Dora's private study. It was a room I was strictly forbidden from entering when she was alive. It was her fortress. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and flipped on the light. The room was pristine, everything in its place. I sat in her leather chair, spinning it slowly. It felt wrong, like she was going to walk in any second and yell at me to get out. I opened the top drawer of her desk. It was empty, which was strange. Dora was a micromanager. She kept notes on everything. I checked the other drawers, empty. I looked over at the paper shredder in the corner. The bin was full. I pulled it out and looked at the strips of paper. It wasn't just standard shredding, it was cross-cut into confetti. Why would she clear out her entire desk before going on a hike? A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the cold air of the house. It was the first creeping suspicion that the accident on the mountain wasn't an accident at all. A few days after I found the empty drawers, I received a formal summons from Mr. Whitlock, the family attorney. Whitlock was a man who looked like he had been carved out of mahogany, stiff, expensive, and unreadable. He asked me to come to his office downtown for the reading of the last will and testament. I almost didn't go. I knew how these things worked. Dora had likely left her fortune to a poodle rescue foundation or a museum wing in her name, just to spite my father's memory. I sat in the waiting room, tugging at the collar of my only suit, which was tight around the shoulders. I was surrounded by oil paintings of old men who looked like they owned countries. I felt small. I checked my bank account on my phone while I waited. I had $42 until payday. I was prepared for the humiliation of being given a token item, maybe a watch or a set of golf clubs, while the billions went elsewhere. When the secretary finally called my name, I walked into the conference room with my guard up. Whitlock was sitting at the head of a table long enough to land a plane on. He didn't offer me coffee. He just pointed to a chair. "Mr. Valerius," he said, his voice dry as dust. "Thank you for coming. Your stepmother's instructions were quite specific regarding this meeting." I braced myself for the final insult from the grave. I expected nothing, but I was about to get everything. Whitlock opened a thick leather folder and adjusted his glasses. The silence in the room was so loud it was actually hurting my ears. He skipped the pleasantries and went straight to the legal jargon. "I, Dora Valerius, being of sound mind and body." He droned on. I zoned out, staring at a smudge on the polished table, waiting for the part where she cut me out. Then, Whitlock's tone changed. He looked up from the paper and stared directly at me. "To my stepson, Elian Valerius," he read clearly, "I leave the entirety of my estate." I blinked. "Excuse me," I croaked. Whitlock continued, ignoring my interruption. "This includes the primary residence, the vacation properties in Aspen and St. Bart's, the investment portfolio, the offshore holdings, and all liquid assets. You are the sole beneficiary, Mr. Valerius." The room started to spin. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. "There has to be a mistake," I said. Dora hated me. She wouldn't give me a parking ticket, let alone. I couldn't even finish the sentence. Whitlock slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a summary of the accounts. My eyes widened until they burned. The number at the bottom wasn't just large, it was astronomical. It was billions. In the span of 30 seconds, I had gone from worrying about my electric bill to being one of the wealthiest people in the state. I was ready to sign the papers and run out of there before they realized it was a prank, but Whitlock held up a hand. "There are stipulations, Mr. Valerius," he warned. "The inheritance is conditional." Of course it was. This was Dora we were talking about. Nothing was ever free. I leaned in, waiting for the catch. I expected her to demand I visit her grave weekly or change my last name. "First," Whitlock listed, "you are forbidden from selling the primary estate or any of its contents for a period of exactly 12 months. Second, you must retain the current household staff, specifically the head of security and the house manager, for that same duration. They are not to be fired or reassigned. I frowned. It was weirdly specific. Why did she care what happened to the house or the staff if she was dead? And finally, Whitlock added, lowering his voice, you must not inquire into the specific nature of the overseas business holdings until the fiscal year ends. You are to be a silent owner. The hair on my arms stood up. It felt less like an inheritance and more like I was being hired for a job I didn't understand. But looking at that number on the paper again, greed won out over suspicion. I picked up the heavy fountain pen and signed my name. I just signed a deal with the devil, and I didn't even care. The transfer took 48 hours to clear. When I logged into my banking app on Friday morning, I thought the screen was glitching. The balance had so many commas, it looked like a phone number. I sat on the edge of my lumpy mattress in my studio apartment and just laughed. It was a hysterical, terrified laugh. I was an overnight billionaire. The feeling was physical, a rush of adrenaline mixed with nausea. I didn't go out and buy a Ferrari. I didn't book a flight to Vegas. I did the most mundane thing possible. I ordered a pizza with extra toppings and didn't worry about the cost. But the reality shifted quickly. By noon, a black SUV was parked outside my building. It was the security team Dora had insisted I keep. The head of security, a guy named Torin who looked like he ate bricks for breakfast, knocked on my door. "Mr. Valerius," he said, not smiling. "It's not safe for you here anymore. We need to move you to the estate." Just like that, my old life was deleted. I packed a single bag. I left my furniture, my half-finished architectural drawings, and my old struggles behind. Riding in the back of that armored car, watching the city blur past, I realized I wasn't just rich. I was isolated. The money had already built a wall between me and the rest of the world. Living in Dora's mansion as the owner was surreal. I slept in the master suite, a room that was bigger than my entire old apartment. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being an intruder. Every time I walked down the grand staircase, I expected Dora to step out of the shadows and scold me for scuffing the floor. This was her house. These were her things. And now this was her money. Imposter syndrome hit me hard. Why me? I kept asking myself that question. Dora was calculated. She never did anything without a reason. Giving me, the stepson she loathed, access to billions of dollars didn't fit her profile. Was she trying to apologize from beyond the grave? That seemed impossible. Was it a mistake in the will? Whitlock seemed too competent for that. I felt like a pawn in a game I couldn't see. I started avoiding the staff. Torin, the security guard, seemed to be watching me a little too closely. The house manager, Mrs. Gable, looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. I was the king of the castle, but I felt like a prisoner. The money solved all my financial problems, but it created a massive, gnawing knot in my stomach. I wasn't just lucky, I was being used. I just didn't know how yet. The piece of my new life was shattered by a single sheet of paper. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral. I was sorting through a stack of mail that had been screened by the security team, mostly sympathy cards and investment brochures. But one envelope had slipped through without a return address. It was plain, white, and unassuming. I almost threw it in the trash, assuming it was junk mail, but curiosity got the better of me. I tore it open. Inside, there was no letter, no threat, no demand for money. There was only a photograph. It was a grainy, zoomed-in shot taken from what looked like a security camera. It showed a woman standing at a gas station counter, buying a bottle of water. She was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, but I knew the jawline. I knew the way she held her purse. It was Dora. My heart hammered against my ribs. That wasn't the scary part. The scary part was the timestamp printed in neon orange at the bottom of the photo, October 14th, 4:15 p.m. According to the police report and the coroner's estimate, Dora had fallen from the cliff at Devil's Drop around 2 p.m. that same day. If this timestamp was real, Dora was buying water 2 hours after she supposedly died. My hands started shaking, so hard I dropped the photo. Someone knew, and they were watching me. I couldn't go to the police. They had already closed the case, and if I walked in with a grainy photo, they'd think I was a grieving son losing his mind. I couldn't go to Torin, the head of security. He was on Dora's payroll long before he was on mine. I needed someone who worked in the shadows. I hired a private investigator named Rook, a man recommended by a friend from my old neighborhood. We met in a dimly lit diner on the edge of town, far away from the prying eyes of the estate. Rook was a grimy, chain-smoking cynic who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I slid the envelope across the sticky table. He studied the photo for a long time, the smoke from his cigarette curling around his fingers. "Timestamps can be faked," he grunted, tapping the image. "But the posture? That's hard to mimic." I paid him $5,000 in cash, an amount that used to be my life savings but was now pocket change. "Find out where this was taken," I told him, "and find out if anyone else saw her." Rook pocketed the cash and gave me a grim look. "If she's alive, kid, she's gone to great lengths to look dead. People who do that don't like being found. You sure you want to turn over this rock?" I nodded. I didn't just want to turn it over, I wanted to smash it. While Rook worked the streets, I went to work on the numbers. I spent the next 3 nights locked in the study, digging through the digital banking records I now controlled. Whitlock had told me to be a silent owner of the offshore accounts, but silence wasn't an option anymore. I needed to know if she had funded her own escape. The sheer volume of wealth was blinding, but I forced myself to look for patterns. It took hours of scrolling through spreadsheets, but then I saw it. In the 7 months leading up to her accident, there was a slow, steady bleed of cash. It wasn't done through wire transfers or large, flaggable transactions. It was methodical. Withdrawals of $9,000, just under the federal reporting limit, made from various ATMs and branches across the state. Then came the consulting fees. 2 weeks before the hike, she had authorized 3 payments of $2 million each to a shell company in the Caymans called Phoenix Consulting. I sat back in the leather chair, the glow of the monitor hurting my eyes. Phoenix, the bird that rises from the ashes. It was so arrogant it was almost funny. She hadn't just died, she had cashed out. She had liquidated millions of dollars to fund a life she was supposedly never going to live. Rook called me 2 days later. "Pack a bag," he said. "We're going for a ride." He picked me up in a beat-up sedan that smelled of stale coffee. We drove 3 hours north, toward the mountains where Dora had allegedly fallen. But we didn't go to the trail. We stopped at a rundown gas station about 20 miles from the park entrance. It was the same location from the photo. Rook led me inside and pointed to the clerk, an older man named Earl with grease-stained hands. "Tell him what you told me," Rook said. Earl wiped the counter with a rag. "Yeah, I remember her," he said, looking at the picture of Dora I held up. "Fancy lady. Too fancy for this place. She didn't have a car, though. She was waiting out back." "Waiting for what?" I asked, my throat tight. "A car," Earl said. "Black sedan. Tinted windows. No plates. She bought a cheap burner phone from the rack, made one quick call, then smashed it and tossed it in the trash can outside before she got in. She didn't look like someone going hiking, son. She looked like someone making a getaway." My stomach dropped. The police found her personal phone on the cliff. That meant she planted it there to fake the accident, then came here and used a throwaway phone to call her driver. She didn't fall. She was picked up. The entire accident scene was a stage set. The drive back to the mansion was a blur of rage. When I got home, I stormed past Torin and the security team, ignoring their questions. I went straight to the master bedroom, Dora's sanctuary. I tore the room apart. I pulled books off the shelves, overturned drawers, and ripped the expensive artwork off the walls. I was looking for the contingency plan. Dora was meticulous. She never did anything without a backup. I found it behind a heavy oil painting of a seascape. There was a seam in the wallpaper. I used a letter opener to slice it open, revealing a small, digital wall safe. I stared at the keypad. I tried her birthday, error. I tried my father's birthday, error. Then, on a hunch, I typed in the date of my father's death. The light turned green. The door clicked open. Inside, there was no money, just a single document. It was a passport. I opened it, and Dora's face stared back at me. But the name didn't say Dora Valerius. It said Kaya Russo. The issue date was 3 months ago. She had been planning this while living under the same roof as me. She looked at me every day, knowing she was about to destroy our lives, and she didn't blink. I held the passport in my hand, feeling the cold, hard weight of the truth. The Ice Queen wasn't dead. She was Kaya Russo, and I was going to find her. With the passport in my trembling hands, I called Rook immediately. "Her name is Kaya Russo," I told him, my voice tight with adrenaline. "Run it. Run everything." Rook didn't ask questions. He went to work, utilizing contacts in places I didn't want to know about. While he dug into the underground, I used the one thing Dora had given me, access. I logged back into the massive offshore accounts she had left me. I searched for any recent activity linked to the name Kaya Russo. It took hours of cross-referencing, but Dora had made one fatal mistake. She was arrogant. She believed that dead women couldn't be tracked. She had used a sub-account linked to the main trust to pay for a satellite internet uplink. The bill was paid automatically every month, debited under a shell corporation, but the subscriber name was listed as E. Russo. The digital breadcrumbs were faint, but they were there. She had tried to scrub her past, but she couldn't resist keeping a tether to her money. That internet connection was her lifeline to the world she pretended to leave behind. I forwarded the IP address to Rook. 20 minutes later, he sent me a map coordinates link. The dot pulsing on the screen wasn't in heaven or hell. It was on a tiny, exclusive island in the Mediterranean, a place known for privacy, luxury, and zero questions asked. The location was a private villa on the coast of Corsica. It was a fortress of solitude disguised as a paradise. I stared at the satellite images on my laptop screen. There was a pool, a private dock, and high walls covered in bougainvillea. It looked peaceful, idyllic, the perfect retirement home for a woman who had scammed the world. It made my blood boil. While I was navigating police inquiries and dodging vultures at her funeral, she was likely sipping wine by that pool. She's in a non-extradition gray zone, Rook explained over the phone. If you go to the police now, she'll see them coming a mile away and vanish again. She has the resources to run forever. He was right. The law was too slow for a woman like Dora. If I wanted answers, I couldn't wait for a warrant. I had to go there myself. I looked around the empty mansion that felt more like a prison every day. I was technically a billionaire, yet I felt like a pauper in her grand scheme. I realized then that the money wasn't a gift, it was a leash. As long as I sat here quietly, she won. I booked a flight on the private jet she had left me. It was the ultimate irony. I was going to use her own wings to hunt her down. The flight was the longest 10 hours of my life. I sat alone in a cabin designed for 20 people, sipping water and staring out at the clouds. The luxury was suffocating. The leather seats, the gold-plated fixtures, it all smelled like her. I had told Torin and the security team I was taking a mental health break, a solo trip to clear my head. They bought it. They didn't know I had a burner phone in my pocket with the coordinates to Dora's hideout. When I landed in France, I rented a nondescript car and took the ferry over to the island. The closer I got, the heavier my chest felt. Was she alone? Was she dangerous? A woman who could fake her own death and abandon her life was capable of anything. I had a flash of fear that she might have a gun or hired muscle. But my anger was stronger than my fear. I drove up the winding coastal roads, the sea crashing against the rocks below. The GPS led me up a steep, private driveway. I parked the car a quarter-mile down the road and walked the rest of the way, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't the stepson anymore. I was the reckoning. I reached the iron gates of the villa. They were unlocked. I slipped through the gates and walked up the stone path. The air smelled of sea salt and jasmine. It was painfully quiet, just the sound of the wind in the olive trees. I rounded the corner of the main house and stepped onto the terrace. And there she was. Dora was lying on a white lounge chair, wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk robe, reading a magazine. She looked exactly the same, imperious, elegant, and very much alive. She reached for a glass of iced tea, her movements languid and relaxed. For a second, I just watched her, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her existence. She wasn't suffering. She wasn't in hiding. She was on vacation. "Hello, Dora," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. She froze. Her hand hovered over her glass. Slowly, she lowered her magazine and peered over the top of her sunglasses. She didn't scream. She didn't jump up. She just looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes. There was a flicker of annoyance, maybe a hint of surprise, but no guilt. "Elian," she said, as if I had just walked into the kitchen for breakfast. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for. I thought it would take you at least a year." I stood over her, my fists clenched. "You're dead," I spat out. "We buried an empty casket. The police think you're fish food." "Why?" Dora sat up, tightening her robe. She gestured for me to sit, as if this were a social call. "Sit down, Elian. You're making me nervous." I didn't move. She sighed, taking a sip of her tea. It was necessary. The Securities and Exchange Commission was days away from indicting me. Massive fraud, embezzlement, insider trading, you name it. I was looking at 20 years in federal prison. She looked me dead in the eye. I couldn't take the money with me, Elian. If I fled, they would have frozen everything. I needed a heir. I needed someone clean, someone stupid enough not to ask questions, to hold the assets until the heat died down. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "I'm not your heir," I whispered. "I'm your bank vault." "Precisely," she smiled, a shark-like grin. "You hold the money, you keep the estate warm, and I pull the strings from here. You get to live like a king, and I stay free. We both win. Unless, of course, you decide to be difficult." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She hadn't left me the money because she cared. She used me because I was the perfect patsy. "Here is the deal, Elian," Dora said, smoothing the silk of her robe. "You go back home. You continue to play the grieving son. You keep the house, the cars, and the billions. In exchange, you wire me a consulting fee every month to an account I provide. It's simple rent for the life I gave you." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Or, you can try to be a hero. You can call the police. But if you do, the government will seize every penny. The assets are tied to the fraud charges. If I go down, the money goes away. You'll be back in that studio apartment eating instant noodles before the ink dries on the arrest warrant. So what's it going to be? Integrity or billions?" It was a perfect trap. She knew exactly where to hit me. She knew I had tasted the good life, the security, the power, the freedom, and she bet everything on the fact that I wouldn't want to give it up. I looked around the villa, at the blue ocean, and then back at her smug face. She wasn't just offering me money, she was offering me silence. I would have to live the rest of my life knowing I was protecting a criminal, looking over my shoulder, forever under her thumb. It was a golden cage, but it was still a cage. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. I didn't see the powerful stepmother anymore. I saw a desperate, lonely woman who had burned every bridge she ever built. She didn't ask me how I was coping with her death. She didn't ask about my father's house. She didn't care about me at all. I was just a signature to her, a useful idiot she could manipulate from 1,000 miles away. A profound sadness washed over me, but it wasn't for her. It was for the boy I used to be, the one who used to try so hard to get her approval. That boy was gone now. In his place was someone who understood that some things cost more than money. Her betrayal wasn't just the fraud, it was the absolute lack of humanity. She had weaponized my grief and turned my life into a shield for her crimes. "You never loved Dad," I said quietly. "And you certainly never gave a damn about me." Dora laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Love is for poor people, Elian. Survival is for the strong. Stop being sentimental and start being smart." That was the moment the last thread of attachment snapped. I realized that if I took her deal, I wouldn't just be rich, I would become her. And that was a price I wasn't willing to pay. "I need time to think," I lied. I kept my face blank, masking the rage boiling underneath. Dora nodded, looking satisfied. "Take the night. There's a guest room prepared. I knew you'd see reason." She waved a hand dismissively, already bored with me. I walked into the house, my heart pounding so hard I thought she could hear it. I went to the guest room, locked the door, and immediately pulled out the burner phone Rook had given me. I didn't call the local police. Dora could buy them off. I called the contact number Rook had provided for the federal agent leading the investigation into her fraud back home. My hands shook as I dialed. "This is Elian Valerius," I whispered when the agent picked up. "I know where she is." I gave them the coordinates. I gave them the alias. I gave them everything. I knew that by making this call, I was torching the fortune. I was setting fire to the billions of dollars that were legally mine. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that was heavier than any bank vault. I packed my bag and climbed out the window. I wasn't going to stay under her roof for one more second. I watched from a ridge overlooking the villa as the authorities arrived the next morning. It was a joint operation, swift and aggressive. I saw Dora being let out in handcuffs, her designer sunglasses missing, her hair messy. She looked small. She looked furious. When she spotted me standing near the police cars, her eyes went wide with shock. She screamed something at me, but the wind carried it away. She had underestimated me until the very end. The fallout was instant and massive. The news broke globally. Dead billionaire found alive in Corsica. The media storm was relentless. I was interrogated for days. I had to hand over the banking access, the keys to the estate, and every document I had. It was a legal nightmare. Because I had cooperated and turned her in, I wasn't charged with any crimes, but the threat Dora made came true. The government froze the assets. The billions were seized as proceeds of a massive Ponzi scheme she had been running for a decade. The mansion was seized. The cars were towed. The accounts were drained to pay back the victims she had defrauded. I watched my net worth plummet from 10 figures to 0 in the span of a week. The vultures who had attended her funeral were now giving interviews about how they always knew she was a crook. It's been several. I'm back in my own apartment. It's small, the radiator clanks, and I have to work for a living again. The billions are gone, returned to the people Dora stole from. But I didn't walk away empty-handed. I received a whistleblower reward from the government, a fraction of the fortune, but enough to pay off my student loans and start my own small architecture firm. I drove past the old estate yesterday. It had a "for sale by government auction" sign on the gate. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt free. Dora is currently serving a 25-year sentence in a federal prison, stripped of her luxury and her control. She has her life, but she lost her freedom. I lost the money, but I got my life back. I learned the hard way that money creates a lot of noise. It buys people, it buys silence, and it buys comfort, but it can't buy a clear conscience. I might not be a billionaire anymore, but when I look in the mirror, I recognize the man staring back at me. And honestly, that's worth more than anything the Ice Queen ever left me.